Hello, and welcome to the first in a series of broadcasts from Montreal, Serai, highlighting artists, writers, poets, performers, musicians, filmmakers, and critical thinkers who are part of the community here in Montreal and Quebec. I would like to say at this point a few words about Montreal Serai itself. We are a 35-year-old organization. We started out as a theater group and a hard copy magazine based here in the city. Our mandate has always been to provide a forum to bring voices in the margins to the center. It has been a long haul and much remains to be done. From what was once open exclusion, racial disdain, and embarrassing lack of awareness about the colonization and migration process, what we have today is a nearly sophisticated process that intellectualizes acceptance as reasonable accommodation. Serai was formed at a time, for those of you who remember, a young black boy, Anthony Griffin, was shot dead in the Notre Dame de Grâce police station compound. His killer was absolved. And at the same time, on the cultural scene, a movie of Hanif Qureshi's was also launched called My Beautiful Laundrette. And those two issues became the first issue of Montreal Serai. Today things have evolved somewhat, and we are up on stage as a unifying center where diversity and inclusion are no longer matters of lip service. This is the center is a space where we perform with the larger community. Each year we add new voices, new perspectives. We continue to be defined by the communities, cultures, and languages we support. Canadian, Quebecois, Indigenous, people of color, multilingual, street artists, stage performers, emerging writers, sculptors, musicians, well-known literary figures, and those who as yet are unseen or not heard of. We have reached a point where we receive nearly 2 million hits per year. My name is Rana Bose, and I'm a founding editor of the magazine. Our guest today is Nigel Thomas. Nigel is the author of 6 novels, 3 collections of short stories, a collection of poems in addition to dozens of essays. We shall be talking with Nigel today about his newly released collection of poems entitled The Voyage, published by Mawenzi House in Toronto. 2 of Nigel's previous novels, Spirits in the Dark and No Safeguards, have been nominated for the Quebec Writers Federation Hugh McLennan Award, and a French translation of Lives, Whole and Otherwise, Des Vies Cassées, was shortlisted for Le Prix Calvet des Lycéens. In 2000, Nigel Thomas was awarded the Jackie Robinson Award for Professional of the Year, and in 2020 he was awarded the Black Theatre Workshop's Martin Luther King Jr. Achievement Award. Nigel is the founder of Lectures, Logos, Readings. He's originally from St. Vincent's. He's a retired professor of United States literature. This is the book we shall be talking about, The Voyage. Nigel, for a start, we'd like you to give our readers and viewers an idea of why you chose to organize this really great book of poems into the 4 sections that you did. What is behind the poems themselves do not seem to have dates, and in each one of them, which is sometimes a practice poets do, but there is yet an enormous chronology in the way you've organized everything. I must also say that the cover is a profound statement in itself. The blue waters that are not very turbulent nor very calm. If you'd like to comment on the first section and the way you organize the whole book, it'll be great.
Well, the poems are more thematically arranged in a certain sense. They're arranged in terms of chronology and in terms of themes. The very first section, for example, self and family, even though those poems were written at different times, yet they come together in that particular section because they reflect on a part of my life before I left St. Vincent. So, and then, of course, there are the poems Affirmation and Resistance and Affirmation. And those poems deal with me in a later period of my life as I observe what's going on. I observe the roles that uh, society attempt to force me into, and so on and so forth, my resistance to such matters. And then there is the section Miscellaneous Reflections, which to a large extent deals with my more quiet observations of what's more or less, you can say, qualities that are permanent in human nature. The final section, Time, uh, or the shortest section, is obviously a reflection on those last 20 years. And as I was preparing for this interview, I thought of the impact of time in the first 20 years of our life, how things occur at a very accelerated pace. And the same thing happens in what you might consider to be the latter 20 years of one's life, where in the first 20 years it's growth to equip you for those 40 years or so, and then in the 20 years it's literally a falling away as decrepitude creeps in and so on. So yes, so that's more or less the logic in the arrangement of
Mm-hmm,
the
mm-hmm.
poems.
Yeah, and in the first section, there is a lot of reference to poverty, deprivation, violence, and a comprehensive, detailed history of your relationship with your father, your grandfather, your grandmother. You've really bared your soul in that sense. And when you write the poem, the very first poem, Return, why did you call it Return? And was that a physical or a mentally contemplated return? Um, Give us some
It's
idea.
it's a mental return that is an amalgam of many returns, many physical, many actual returns to that place of my birth. And the poem is more so about why there is the need to return. And that need, the reason for returning is stated in the very first stanza, where the speaker says, these sounds, these birds, this sky, this sea, still go my reality. And in the very end of the very last stanza, there is the cedar tree that he considers to be sort of like the umbilical, that is a stand-in for the umbilical attachment to St. Vincent. Yeah, and um, that poem contained many, many stanzas that dealt with um, more painful experiences, but I eventually did take them out and develop them in other poems elsewhere in the section. Um, though there are certain scenes, for example, more cinematic, you could say, like for example, the women washing in the river. with the water up to their knees, and then it moves from the physical to making something along the lines of history. And the men at the rum shop
Yes.
self-anesthetizing,
Yes.
the pain of history, and so on. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, I just wanted you to comment on the village or the town, Dixon, and yeah, it's also in your mother's
Name.
name,
Yes.
yeah. And what is the relationship? Was Dixon a small town or a village?
Well, it was. I said recently in another forum that there were about 1,000 people there when I was born. But went back and I began trying to calculate, because you could remember, I guess, childhood memory such that you can literally remember all the houses in the different places. This was probably more like 700. Might have been about 1,000 before migration began to Great Britain. So a lot of people, their households where as many as 6, 7, 8 members went to live in Britain. But yeah, it was that village of about 700 people, and it's named after a colonial ancestor. Um, it was, I mean, it was 1/3 of the community actually earned its living working on the Monbentic estate, a plantation nearby. The other 2/3 they had holdings of varying sizes. I think the average person would have probably had maybe about 4 acres, the wealthier ones. There were about 6 families in the village that had maybe in the 20 acres and more, but most people had no more than 4 acres.
Mm-hmm.
So it was largely a peasant community. Okay. Therefore, I'm not sure I worry that much about when the poems were written. I'm much more concerned about the particular time in my life that the poem deals with. And so, for example, in Self and Family, some of those poems were written fairly recently, but they touch upon aspects of my life during my childhood, my years in St. Vincent, certainly before age 21. And so the proper place for them is in that particular section. Yeah. The poem, for example, Village Afternoon, was written in late 2020, and it's the second poem in the collection, but it it pertains to a memory that would probably be relevant when I was about 11 or 12, for example.
Yeah. In that first section, poverty, deprivation, violence. There's a fairly detailed, comprehensive history of your growing up vis-a-vis your parents, granddad. You've bared your soul. Your first poem is named Return.
Right.
Why did you call it Return?
Well, in a sense, it is the poem itself is a mental voyage because it was written while I was here in Canada, and I don't know, this is probably the version you're seeing is perhaps the 6th or 7th incarnation of the poem. It wasn't written after a single voyage to St. Vincent, but rather after several voyages.
Right.
And it was sort of a distillation of what impresses me most, and I mean impress in a very general sense, not in the sense of I mean, what caught my attention, so to speak, most are the things that caught my attention most are what's listed there. I mean, that particular poem had a lot of negative stuff. And that negative stuff is actually found in the other poems. And I felt that this one I should spare the reader that negative stuff because what in fact is in the poem is what I want to hold on to in a certain sense. It's what compels me to return. You know, these birds, these songs, this sky, this sea. You know, still God, my reality. Yeah, and essentially, yes, that's really what it is.
In the poem Village Afternoon,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about sends me back to Dixon, to
Yes.
visions of ourselves. Now, just out of curiosity, nothing very, I'm not being unnecessarily inquisitive, but Dixon is the name of a village or
Yes.
of a town or
It's
part of
it's
a town.
it's the name of a village. It's also the name of my. It's also the patronym for my maternal grandparent, my maternal
Correct. That
grandfather.
was that
Yeah.
was that was the question I was going to ask. Yeah, I
Mhm.
found it curious and I understand it, but I do understand that link because where I grew up in India, not exactly where I grew up, but in various parts of India, people were in the south were named after their villages. It was traditional to take the name. The middle part of the name was often a part of the village, and it was often where the father came from. You
Right.
know.
Yeah. In this particular case, though, the village derived its name from my colonial ancestor.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, I read um, the very long poem about your granddad.
Mm-hmm.
It was wonderfully composed, wonderfully done, uh, despite the descriptions of vileness that runs subliminally or overtly through the whole thing. I found it a great, great expression. I'll,
You know, I am composing. I composed that poem, and it's a fairly recent poem.
okay.
I'm almost sure that I compiled it after I received the Martin Luther King Jr. Award. So it actually was composed after the 1st of February 2020.
Okay.
The poem covering my backside was actually composed about 3 years ago. And that poem is actually linked to my granddad, the poem about my grandfather as well.
Yeah.
But interestingly, the backside poem came out before,
Yep.
and then it led me to it pushed me to reflect more seriously about my grandfather. And I also have said in the past quite a few very flattering things about my grandfather, certainly on my website. He was a wonderful man in the sense that he taught me to read and write before I went to school and was interested in my academic progress and so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. He took me from my parents when he realized that there was not much of a future there and so on. So I felt that deep sense of gratitude to him. But all of that came after he had been a very destructive element in
Mm-hmm.
his own family. And so I felt that rather than give this rather glowing portrait of him, which I've done on my website, I might as well tell the entire truth. And it's a truth that is more in keeping with Caribbean reality than the one that I presented on my website.
Yeah, he seems he presented you with a much more complex uh, sort of interaction for you.
Mm-hmm.
In the poem Black Point, Saint Vincent, it's quite poignant and
Yeah.
it seemed like you were contemplating ending your life.
Yes, I was. I was. I did go to Black Point. Well, actually, it wasn't at Black Point that I would have committed suicide, but the contemplation, but it would have been in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
I conflate the two in the poem. But I certainly, that poem came out of a reflection in a sense, the original title of the poem was Contemplation at Black Point.
Mm-hmm.
And my publisher decided to reduce it to a Black Point, which I agreed with. Um, the contemplation is obviously implicit in the poem. Um, yes, I went there. I went to the Atlantic intending to kill myself, and fear of hell prevented me.
Yeah, I love the simple statement you make there.
Yeah,
In my childhood, this ocean was my analogy for my father's cruelty. I
right.
came here at age 11 to end the hell I lived in, but fear of that other hell where I'd roast alive eternally shackled me.
Yes, indeed, it did. I don't think I could put it any other way.
Yeah, yeah. Uh,
But you
so,
would probably notice that. All right, I'll let you continue rather
yeah,
than.
I also found another interesting section where you say, Granddad had warned you that the man you were about to marry might be misshaped by plantation cruelty, and he
Mhm.
banished you from the family for what he called your stupidity. What an exercise in hypocrisy.
Mhm.
What exactly, what, I mean, I kind of understand what you're saying, but I'd like to hear it from you exactly what.
Yeah. Well, when my mother, that poem is about my mother. It's upon my mother,
Yeah.
and it's a contemplation on her. And of course, if you notice, the poem begins when I was 16, and I asked her why
Mm-hmm.
she was still enduring the sort of existence my father was subjecting her, had been subjecting her to. And the reflection goes on.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, I knew the history of my mother's marriage, and because it was related, they went over it time and time again,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, I knew that my grandfather did try to dissuade my mother from marrying my father. I knew that for 5 years he did not speak to her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only at my birth that the reconciliation took place.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, he named me Hubert Nigel. Nigel meaning black because I was darkest of my mother's then three children.
Yeah, you
And
mentioned that elsewhere. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, I do know that my grandfather he used some terms that could probably be seen as racist. It could be seen as racist in his
Mm-hmm.
description of my father.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't exactly. He did use the word plantation, but it was followed by not by the N word,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, you know, he treat you the way they treat mules and son. Um, and and in a sense, he was right. I mean, he was right.
Yeah. So you then we come to the section resistance and affirmation. Okay. And you talk about the empire writes back, which I remember that expression was widely used when in the 70s and early 80s when
Helen Tiflin.
Yes.
And others, yes.
And Salman Rushdie and others started emerging on the scene. And of course, The Economist had it on its cover. And knowing The Economist as an outright but sophisticated apologist for imperial culture,
an arm of capitalism.
Yes, he used that expression. Anyway, so I love the poems there because you're into a certain rhythm in your poetry there. Foreclosure, reparations, all of them have a beat to them, and it appeals to me a lot. Not that I am differentiating with the first section, but I found an interesting statement here in O Canada,
yes.
Where you say, "It's half a century now since you adopted me, but I still fear the attic of your house and don't like venturing underground, but I'll defend it." So what's in this attic?
Well, both the basement and the attic are somewhat on a continuum.
Yeah.
The attic generally in North America at any rate is a place where you put things that are cluttering the living space, but you still think that those things are useful and valuable, and you might retrieve them as need be, or you might just leave them there, and very often after your death your children go and rummage through them and so on and so forth. And the attic is sort of like an analogy for those things that you don't really want to have to deal with, you don't want to be encountering every day.
Yeah.
And sort of like, I guess the term I would use for that is sort of like those people who are racist and they receive some kind of sensitivity training and they say, okay, all right, I'll modulate my behavior. I won't really show what I truly believe or act the way I would like to act, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, is the speaker in the poem is saying, I'm not going to confront you there because in essence, you can't confront what isn't visible. It's hidden. So it's probably a place for sort of like hidden evils, so to speak.
You're being very nice
Yeah.
to this country.
Well,
I thought you were going to talk about skeletons.
Well, no, I wouldn't.
I'm just pushing you.
I didn't really think of, no, I wasn't thinking in terms of skeletons. I really was thinking, and it can be read at another level as well. It's sort of places where you're not going to venture, but
right.
It's really more so those things that you really don't know how to confront. I mean, the speaker in the poem still says, he doesn't like going into the attic because it's very uncomfortable going into the attic. How do you talk to someone? How do you say, I mean, I know you're a racist, and they turn around and they say, prove it, that sort of thing.
Right.
Now, the underground, on the other hand, is for that stuff that is deeply embedded, and the underground, as you know, is an archetype. It's for those things that are so deeply embedded that reason doesn't even reach them. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Excellent. The next section is Miscellaneous Reflections.
Mhm.
I'm going. If you're okay with it, I'm going to ask you to read from Bone and Gut Logic. It's a short poem, but you know, I loved it. So it's the kind of performance piece that I like.
All right, let me find it here.
Page 61.
Yep. Bone and gut logic. What's felt in the gut hates to be censored by the brain, and what's bred in the bone often befuddles the brain. And if the brain insists it's in control, minions of the bone and gut stand ready to cuss, cuff, and the rest. This, populists and tribalists, indeed all politicians, know what's felt in the tribe can create instant or lasting tribes with codes and creeds and even armies so cleverly even the brain gets fooled.
All right. Uh, uh, I in this section, the poems are peppered with references to one of my favorite writers, of course, but it's a cliche to keep saying this. A lot of people have suddenly discovered James Baldwin, but
Mhm.
Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, Langston, Kafka, Milton, Frost. It shows that you taught, and Walden, Thoreau, everybody. Um, uh, who really were writers and poets? I mean, I guess this is a very sophomore question, I would say, but who really kind of influenced you? I mean, I used to love Langston Hughes, and but I like Baraka in a different way. I like Gil Scott Heron and his music and
Yeah,
poetry
yeah.
and things like that. So I just wanted your take.
Um, well, certainly, it's very, very, very difficult to say who my poetic influences are. I came to African American literature as an adult. Um, I came to English colonial literature as a child. Um, and so, for example, my first love of poetry came largely from Methodist hymns and from poems by William Blake, the sort of poems that we were forced to recite. But I enjoyed reciting poetry. Um, I remember in at age 9, reciting Blake's Piping Down the Valley's Wild, pipe a song of pleasant glee. On a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, there's also Tiger, Tiger burning bright in the forests of the night and so on. Even before that, there was British, funny, I can't remember his name now, but he was a poet laureate at one point. A small, short poem called In the Land of Come to Pain. And that I remember memorizing when I was about 6 or 7. So the rhythms, as it were, of British poetry were there before I encountered African American poetry. And I only became exposed, for example, to Caribbean literature when I came to North America. St. Vincent, the St. Vincent I grew up in was a colony. And it was really very effectively administered as a colony. In other words, anything you did not want the population to know, you simply kept it out. Um, and so there was no interest in colonizers having us know that there were Blacks who were writing, for example. Um, they certainly wanted us to think that anything that they would have called civilized emanated from them. So yeah, I would say that perhaps my poetic sensibility was formed much more so by good poets, Blake certainly, but and Wordsworth, but they were not. It wasn't an African American or an African Caribbean or Caribbean sensibility that influenced me initially. Of course, I came to North America and became exposed to a plethora of stuff that I did not at first know about. I remember one of the very first books I read here was the Bandung Conference. And it opened my eyes and very followed, that was very soon followed by Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, and so on and so forth. And I mean, I became a ravenous consumer of African American because that was the literature that was available at the time, African American literature. Uh, Later on, African literature, but that came later. And eventually Caribbean, and very much later, African Canadian. So I have different. I cannot specifically say who influenced me in writing poetry. I really don't know. Poetry, as Wards would say, is emotion recollected in tranquility. And that's perhaps how most of my poetry is born. I can say very specifically, I know what the influences are when it comes to prose, when it comes to prose fiction. But in terms of poetry, no.
That's very fair, and
Yeah.
in many ways it also strikes a bell for me because I went to a Jesuit school, and the Jesuits were mainly from Liechtenstein or Belgium,
Okay.
and but the curriculum was still Matthew Arnold, Blake, and Wordsworth, Tennyson, and things like that. And but fortunately, when I came home, I would hear about Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson.
Right.
And later on, when I left the country, I read books by Ellison, George Jackson, and Angela Davis, and
Right.
so then I came to study in the U.S., and it was right at the time of the Vietnam War, so
Right.
it was a different era.
Well,
So,
Sean, sorry to interrupt, but I can tell you how vicious things were in terms of keeping stuff out. There were like people, Vincentians, for example, who had traveled abroad and who were sending back books to people in St. Vincent. And very soon, the legislature in St. Vincent passed a law
yeah,
banning those books
yeah,
and imposing huge penalties on anyone caught with.
correct, yeah.
Yeah.
It's the insecurities of the colonized, and I'm going to ask you to read another poem, the last poem, I think, the Voyage itself. It's a 2-page
Very
poem.
last poem, yes.
Yeah, if you don't mind, and we'll have some comments after that.
Right.
Unless you want to read something else, that's fine
No,
with
no,
me.
no, no, it's fine. It's fine. The Voyage. In this time's turbulent sea, my vessel's engine chokes constantly. The joys groan and the fissures widen. I bail and wonder how long before the chasm claims me. I still can see in the dimness of my imagination the shore I started from, the solid land where I might have stayed stagnating, seething with hate, and looked upon as human waste. Still, this voyage has to be done alone, even with a mate and a crew, and crafts nearby that offer help in perilous times. What have I brought from the ports where I've sojourned? What have I brought? I only know that I know only that time's the pilot in time's sea, charting the waves and charting me, like God, self-created and governing all he created, even when I think I'm in control. Already I note the accelerating weakening of the engine and wonder how soon I'll have to be told, "Oh fate, let me not be marooned for long in this or any other port."
Great.
Mhm.
Thank you, Nigel. If you have anything further to say about our discussion and your book.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's just one thing I would like to say is that those poems, for example, that are miscellaneous reflections, are in a sense Nigel Thomas, the observer, reflecting on what's more or less constant in human nature, um, and fundamentally tragic in a sense, insofar as it's constant, insofar as those qualities, tendencies do not necessarily benefit humanity and have been present from the very start and so on. I'm thinking, for example, of a poem like Bloodstain, which examines how power works and just how indifferent it is, how impossible it is to truly, truly do more than make dents in what it actually does. And I'm reminded in all of this, if one brings the topic back to things like racism, for example, of Alice Walker's reflection that racism is like weeds. You constantly must be pulling them up, or they would stifle whatever it is that you wish to cultivate. Um, so I suppose in that regard, I'm doing pretty much what most poets have done, is sort of little like elegies written on the human condition.
Yep. You know, I've always felt. I mean, I've felt my views solidifying about racism, not just as an oppressive behavior by a majority
Right.
community here, but as a social construct,
Oh yes.
and You know, I found it astounding at one point, not now anymore, that there was a saint called Saint Benedict.
Mm-hmm.
He was, I believe, he was either a Moor or from the Nile Delta,
Yeah.
and he was black. He
Mm-hmm.
was a black saint,
Yes.
and he is all over Italy. You know, for a long time, people had no clue,
Right.
absolutely no clue. There were a couple of other saints, one from North America and one from South America, who were also black.
Yes.
And it was not known, it was not really known. And when it was found out, and when it all became an issue, and the slave trade, this is preceding, Benedict was preceding the slave trade.
Yeah.
And the moment the slave trade happened, then things started getting very vicious. The commentary and the discourse. You know, people started discovering, oh, Benedict was a black man. And, you know, and they started
They have to
changing.
they had to whiten him. Yes.
No, actually, what they did in you know, the what is it?
Church father.
The
The church father.
glasswork. What is the name? I forget. The glasswork that is in all the churches.
With the stained glass
The stained
windows.
glass.
Yeah.
Chagall
Yeah.
is famous for it. They
Mm-hmm.
started, you know, darkening his skin
Mm-hmm.
a little bit because they suddenly realized that he may not be one of us, kind of thing, and and his hair started emerging as a little bit knotted and
Somewhat
curly.
curly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, and things like that. And
No, there is an order. I mean, founded in his name. I mean, the Benedictine monks, for example.
yeah, yeah. Anyway,
The Black Saint is very much um, honored in Guatemala, for example, in
yeah,
southern Guatemala, um, which is not necessarily a country that pays attention to people of African descent. Yeah,
yeah. Um,
I don't remember his name.
I don't either, but yes, he was also sort of liberated and
His statue in the church, somewhere in southern Guatemala, is actually black,
okay,
and there's a great deal of commentary about him in travel guides and that sort
okay,
of thing.
okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I should say thanks for the opportunity to discuss the poems.
Yeah,
As you saw, they deal with real issues,
yeah,
and they're written in language that is accessible, and that's deliberate on my part.
okay. Yeah, I appreciated it very much. So, for
Mhm.
those of you who are listening in, I've been talking to Nigel Thomas and his new book of poems. I think it's showing in reverse.
No, no, I'm seeing it in
You're seeing it correct?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah,
yes.
okay. It's published by Malwenzi House in Toronto. It is available in all the usual online
And better bookstores.
and and bookstores. And I once again want to thank you on behalf of Montreal Serai for hanging in there and supporting us also in so many ways.
Yes, yeah, I can say the poems are in line with the sort of consciousness raising that
Yeah,
I hope the poems are sort of like in line with the sort of consciousness raising that Serai
yeah,
seeks to do in
yes,
its
yes,
audience. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And thank you so much.
I should say thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the poems, and to the audience, whatever bungles I make, I apologize for them.
I'm sure I've
And
made some bungles.
feel free to ask me any questions. You'll find me on Facebook, and there's my website, hnigelthomas.org. So, yeah. Thank you very much, Rana. I really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.
Yes.